When two capable systems read the same material and return different answers, most people try to resolve the disagreement. The instinct is reasonable. One of them must be more right. Find the better answer, move on. That is how disagreement is supposed to work, as a problem to be solved rather than a signal to be read.
That instinct is the thing that closes down the most valuable output the comparison produced. Not the answers. The gap between them. The place where two systems with access to the same material pulled in different directions, honestly, specifically, each following a genuine path in the terrain. That gap is a map. The instinct to resolve it is the instinct to fold the map back up before reading it.
The data is in the difference.
What the disagreement between AI systems actually contains, and what becomes possible when you learn to read it instead of resolve it. A documentary in 3 parts.
Every capable AI system is a terrain. Not a database, not a mind, a compressed structure of relationships drawn from an enormous range of material, each one shaped differently by what it was built from and how it learned to navigate. When your material enters that terrain, it activates a region. Different systems activate differently. What each one returns is a genuine reading of a genuine path through the material. The divergence between them is not inconsistency. It is the shape of your material becoming visible from more than one angle simultaneously.
The question that replaces which one is right is this: what property of my material would produce both of these readings simultaneously? That question is where judgment enters the practice. Not before the comparison, after it. Not instead of the systems, because of what they found when they disagreed. That question is what the systems cannot ask about themselves. It requires someone who brought the material and knows what it was trying to be.
This series follows a discovery that began as a musing. Not a plan, not a designed experiment, a question held loosely. What if the disagreement between systems was signal rather than noise? The question was small. What came back from testing it was not small. And what developed from that testing, over time, was a practice that the original musing could not have predicted.
The practice that developed is not a set of techniques to follow in sequence. It is a skill that operates above the individual practices that compose it: routing intuition, divergence reading, the coaxing and reseeding that keep the field alive, the confirmation discipline that makes each output solid before the next step depends on it. These do not stay separate. They weave across each other's concerns and dependencies. This series demonstrates their shape without laying them out as steps, because steps are not what they are.
3 parts. The first names the mechanism, what the disagreement between systems is actually made of, and why the literary scanner discovery demonstrated something no single instrument reading could have shown. The second names the practice, how the routing table develops as terrain knowledge rather than preference, and what reading the gaps actually looks like in a developed session. The third reaches the meta skill, where the instruments begin to direct each other, and the practitioner's role becomes maintaining the conditions under which that can happen.
Bring patience to this. The capacity described here does not arrive from reading about it. It develops through practice, through the accumulated friction of routing decisions made and tested, divergences read and followed, fields enriched and reseeded. What this series offers is not the capacity itself but the recognition of its shape. The recognition changes what you notice in your own sessions. That noticing is the beginning of the development.
The systems were never going to agree on your material. Your material is too specific for consensus. The divergence is not a limitation of the instruments. It is the instruments giving you an accurate account of the complexity of what you brought. The disagreement is the honest reading. The practice is learning to read it.
Part 1 begins with what the disagreement is made of.
When two capable systems return different readings of the same material, they are not both making errors. They are each being honest.
That distinction, between error and honesty, is the whole thing. A system that fails to understand the material produces noise. A system that follows a genuine path through the material and returns what it found there is not failing. It is showing you one true dimension of something that has more than one. The problem is not the disagreement. The problem is the instinct that treats disagreement as error requiring resolution rather than signal requiring reading.
This video is about what the disagreement is actually made of. Not what to do with it yet, what it is. Because the practitioner who understands what the divergence contains reads it differently than the practitioner who only knows it needs to be resolved. The data is in the difference.
What the disagreement between systems is actually made of, and why the literary scanner found something no single instrument could have shown. Part 1 of 3.
Every capable AI system is a terrain, a compressed structure of relationships drawn from an enormous range of material, each one shaped differently by what it was built from and how it learned to navigate. The terrain of one system is not the terrain of another. They were formed from different emphases, trained with different weights, calibrated toward different kinds of response. When the same material enters different terrains, it activates differently. What each system returns is not an answer. It is a reading of the path that terrain opened into that material.
The divergence between their outputs is not the difference between right and wrong. It is the difference between two genuine orientations toward the same thing. One terrain attends to what the material does to a reader's body, its pacing, its somatic rhythm, the physical experience of moving through it. Another attends to what the material does structurally, how its architecture produces its effects, what mechanisms are operating underneath the surface experience. Both orientations are real. Both are present in the material. Neither can see the other from inside its own reading.
The discovery that the divergence was a precision instrument rather than a problem began as a musing, small, held loosely. What if the disagreement between systems was signal rather than noise? Not a designed experiment, a question that seemed worth testing before anyone could be sure there was anything real in it.
The test was on literary material. Classic texts, the kind that have been analyzed by human readers for generations, the kind where the question of what the writing is doing has been argued from many angles without being settled. The same passages routed through several systems. Not asking each one to be better than the others. Asking each one to read what was there and return what it found.
What came back was genuinely surprising. Not because the individual outputs were more sophisticated than expected. Because the gap between them was a map of the text that no single reading had produced. One system attended to somatic effects, what the language was doing to the reader's body, the pacing, the rhythm, the physical experience of inhabiting the prose. Another attended to structural mechanisms, how the architecture of the passage generated its effects, what the construction was doing underneath what the surface said. A third attended to the emotional logic, the sequence of states, the writing moved a reader through, and the transitions between them.
None of the individual readings was wrong. None of them was complete. The somatic reading could not see what the structural reading found. The structural reading could not see what the emotional logic reading found. But together, in the gaps between them, in the places where they agreed and the places where they pulled in different directions, the text became legible in a way it had not been from inside any single instrument. The musing had found something real. Not because it was designed to. Because it followed the divergence instead of resolving it.
There is a counterintuitive implication here that matters. The instinct when outputs diverge is to assume something went wrong. The material was unclear, the systems are inconsistent. A better prompt would produce consensus. The opposite is usually true. Thin material produces consensus because there is only one well-worn path through it, and all the systems find it. Rich material produces divergence because it genuinely opens into more than one direction, and different systems follow different ones without distortion.
This means that the amount of divergence you get from your material is diagnostic. High consensus from multiple capable systems is often a sign of thin material, material that gave the systems nothing unusual to navigate, no specific density that would pull them in different directions. Significant divergence from multiple capable systems is often a sign that the material is genuinely rich, that it contains dimensions each system found real paths into. The disagreement is not the problem. It is the evidence that something specific is there.
What the literary scanner discovered extended beyond literature. The same principle operated on song lyrics. What a lyric was doing rhythmically and somatically in one system's reading, what it was doing emotionally and structurally in another's. The gaps between the readings were consistently more informative than any single reading. The scanner became a multi-domain instrument not by being redesigned for each domain, but by the same underlying discovery holding across domains.
Code showed the same pattern. One system attended to what a function was doing to the architecture of the system it lived in, the assumptions it was installing, the boundaries it was blurring, the invariants it was relying on that no other component had declared. Another attended to what it was doing to the developer reading it, the mental model it was building or disrupting, the cognitive load it was distributing or concentrating. A third attended to what it was doing to the runtime, the performance implications, the edge cases, the paths that would be activated under conditions the original developer hadn't anticipated. 3 genuine readings of the same code. None of them complete alone. The gaps between them the map that mattered.
The instrument only works because of what the practitioner brings to it. The divergence between systems is only a precision instrument if the practitioner can read what the gap contains, and reading the gap requires knowing what the material was trying to be. The systems cannot supply that knowledge. They can find real paths through the terrain. They cannot evaluate whether the path served the purpose. That evaluation requires someone who brought the material and knows its intention.
This is the think package operating at the level of the divergence. What you bring to the comparison is not just the material. It is the accumulated context of what the material is for, the specific domain knowledge, the earned constraints, the standard the output will be held to. Without that context, the divergence between systems is interesting data with no frame to read it against. With it, the divergence becomes a precision diagnostic. Here is where the systems agreed and the agreement is probably solid. Here is where they diverged and the divergence is probably where your judgment is the actual contribution.
The distinction between a system failing and a system being honest about complexity is the fundamental skill this practice requires. Both look like disagreement from the outside. Both produce outputs that do not match each other. The diagnostic question is specific. Did the system fail to understand the material, or did it follow a genuine path that a different system did not follow? The first calls for better material or better framing. The second calls for reading what the path found.
The practitioner who has developed this distinction notices it in the texture of the divergence. Noise looks different from signal when you have learned to read both. Noise is unsystematic, it varies without pattern, it does not cohere with what the system does well elsewhere, it does not point consistently in any direction. Signal is systematic, it coheres with the system's characteristic orientations, it points in a direction that makes sense given what that terrain attends to, it reveals something about the material rather than something about the system's current limitations.
Once the divergence is readable as signal, something else becomes possible. The practitioner can begin to construct comparisons deliberately, routing the same material through systems with different characteristic orientations, not to find the best answer but to find which dimensions of the material each terrain reveals. The instrument is now being used rather than merely encountered. The routing decision is no longer about preference or habit. It is about what the comparison will show.
The scanner system that developed from the original Musing was not designed to work across literary analysis, lyric analysis, and code analysis. It was built once, on one domain, from one discovery, and the discovery held across domains because the underlying principle held. The disagreement between systems is a function of the richness of the material and the genuineness of each system's reading. Rich material. Genuine instruments. The gaps between them are the data.
The Musing asked whether the disagreement was signal or noise. What came back from testing it was not an answer to that question. It was a more interesting question. If the divergence is a map of dimensions in the material, what does the practitioner do with the map? How does reading the gaps become a practice rather than an occasional observation? That is what Part 2 is about.
Part 2 begins with the routing table, not as a preference or an efficiency measure, but as a precision instrument built from friction. The terrain knowledge that develops when the divergences have been read long enough to become legible as something more than surprises.
The routing table did not begin as a plan. It began as a map drawn by repeated friction.
Each routing decision started as a ceiling hit. A system that kept building impressive architecture around ideas that exceeded what the evidence could support. Another that kept finding the edges of claims and returning boundary maps instead of answers. A third that held the structural coherence of long exchanges in a way the others couldn't sustain. None of those characteristics were in the documentation. They were discovered by routing the same material through each system and watching what the divergence revealed about the system's actual terrain.
The routing table is the residue of those frictions, not a guide to which system is best, a map of what each system's disagreement with the others actually means. That map is what this video is about. The data is in the difference.
Reading the gaps. How the routing table develops as terrain knowledge, what the AI-constructed prompt actually is, and the confirmation discipline that makes output solid rather than approximately right. Part 2 of 3.
Once the gap is readable as signal rather than noise, one question governs everything that follows. How do you work with what you find there without getting lost in it? The routing table, the confirmation discipline, the reseeding practice, these are not separate answers to separate problems. They are the same answer to that one question, operating at different moments in the same developing session. Terrain knowledge is what the routing table becomes once it has been built through friction rather than read from a specification. It is not knowing which system scores higher on benchmarks. It is knowing which system's characteristic distortions are assets for which kind of work at which phase of a developing project. The system that over-architects under pressure is a liability in early exploration and an asset when the work needs its logic made explicit and complete. The same characteristic, different moments. The terrain knowledge is knowing which moment you are in.
The routing table that emerged from repeated friction in this practice, one system detects density and assembles artifacts, it can hold a large complex field and find the spine of it. Another structures, audits, and refines. It is the skeptical instrument, the boundary finder, the one that returns the actual size of what can be claimed. A third scans terrain and finds the academic landscape, broad, fast, best used before the specific claims are formed. The routing is not fixed. When a system updates, the terrain shifts, and the map drawn by 6 months of friction may no longer describe the landscape it was built on.
This is why terrain knowledge matters more than the routing table itself. The practitioner who has only the document is more vulnerable than the practitioner who also has the feel, the substrate sense that registers when a system's yield has changed quality before the rational mind has confirmed it. The document describes a terrain that existed. The field detects when the terrain has moved underneath the description. Reading the gaps requires a specific question. Not which system is right, not which output is better. What property of my material will produce both of these readings simultaneously? That question orients the practitioner toward the material rather than toward the systems. The systems are instruments. The material is the subject. The divergence is what the instruments are showing you about the subject from different angles.
In practice, this question arrives after you have stopped expecting the systems to agree. Before that threshold, divergence is frustrating, a signal that something went wrong that needs to be fixed. After it, divergence is interesting, a signal that something is genuinely ambiguous in the material and your judgment about which direction to take is the actual contribution. The threshold is not a technique you learn. It is a disposition that develops once the divergences have been read often enough to be recognizable as information rather than failure.
Before the gap can be read, the field has to be dense enough to produce a genuine divergence. Thin material sent through multiple systems produces consensus around the generic, The systems agree because the material gave them nothing unusual to navigate. Dense material produces real divergence because it genuinely opens into multiple directions. The practice of building that density has a texture, not specifying and commanding, but coaxing and musing. Loose associative questions that let the field develop without forcing it toward a predetermined shape.
The musing that asked whether model disagreement was signal or noise was this kind of question. Not a designed experiment. A direction held loosely and followed. The coaxing that built the scanner vocabulary, what if we compared at this level, what if we asked this particular question of the text, was the same motion at smaller scale. Each one adding density to the field without demanding a specific shape from it. The field developed its specificity through accumulated small additions rather than through a single well-formed specification. By the time it was ready to be tested, it had a richness that the specification alone would not have produced.
When the field is dense enough, something happens that changes the practitioner's role in a specific way. The system begins to crystallize the next step more precisely than the practitioner could have specified it from outside the field. Not because the system is more intelligent than the practitioner, because the accumulated context of the conversation contains information about what is needed next that the practitioner could not have held in mind cold, the vocabulary that has developed, the standard that has been demonstrated, the specific shape of what is being built. The prompt that emerges from that context is the field expressing what it has become ready to produce.
This applies across the kinds of prompts that are most costly to construct manually. The deep research report prompt built by the conversation to be handed to another system, it knows the vocabulary, the constraints, the level of specificity required, the things that have already been established that should not be reopened. The scanner prompt that encodes the specific orientation developed through the accumulated exchange. The think package assembled from the session's dense core to be reseeded into a clean thread. The video pipeline prompt that carries both the visual grammar and the content logic simultaneously. In each case, the prompt is better than what the practitioner would have written cold because it crystallized from context the practitioner accumulated rather than from specification the practitioner composed.
The AI-constructed prompt is not automatically solid. Systems tend to refactor in small ways, adjustments that seem minor individually and accumulate into drift from what was actually established. The confirmation discipline is the practice of checking whether what crystallized is actually what was needed, and checking again until it is solid rather than approximately right. Not perfecting. Confirming that the output can be stood on before the next step depends on it.
Every small drift in the constructed output is a diagnostic. It shows where the specification was not yet anchored firmly enough, where the field had density but the crystallization found a slightly different shape than what the density should have implied. The reconfirmation pass is not error correction in the usual sense. It is the final calibration that closes the gap between what the field accumulated and what the prompt carries forward. The practitioner who accepts the approximately right version is building on ground that has not been fully tested. The practitioner who confirms until it is solid is building on something that can carry the next stage.
Extended sessions accumulate drift alongside density. The vocabulary stays precise, the direction stays clear, but noise accumulates, tangential exchanges, dead ends that have been identified but are still present in the context, framings that were useful at an earlier phase and are now slightly wrong. Reseeding a clean thread is the discipline that separates what is worth carrying from what should be left behind. Not starting over. Carrying the dense core of what has been built into fresh terrain, so the new generation inherits the accumulated specificity without the accumulated noise.
The think package is what makes reseeding precise rather than approximate. Not a summary of what happened, a crystallization of what matters to carry forward. The vocabulary that has been developed and must be used consistently. The constraints that have been established and should not be reopened. The standard of quality that has been demonstrated and needs to be present in the new thread from the beginning. The specific shape of what is being built, dense enough that the new session begins from the accumulated specificity rather than from empty. The think package is the field's distillation. The clean thread is the fresh terrain it enters.
The routing, the divergence reading, the confirmation discipline, the reseeding, these are not separate steps that happen in sequence. They weave across each other's concerns and dependencies. The routing decision informs what divergence to expect. The divergence reading informs whether the confirmation is complete. The confirmation discipline reveals what needs to be carried into the reseed and what should be left behind. Each practice is running a check on the others, not in a designed sequence, but in the continuous mutual calibration of a developed working method.
In practice, this looks like routing the material, reading the divergence, asking what the gap reveals, adjusting the seed, running the confirmation pass, noticing what drifted, reseeding with the adjusted density, watching what the new thread produces, and at every stage asking whether the current output is solid or approximately right, whether the gap between systems is noise or signal, whether the field needs enriching or is ready to crystallize. The question at each stage is the same question. The instrument doing the checking changes. The cross-checking is the practice.
The practitioner who has been working this way long enough develops something that looks different from the outside than it looks from inside. From the outside it looks like intuition. They seem to know without deliberation which system to use, when the output is solid, when the field needs enriching, when the reseed is ready. From the inside, it is accumulated terrain knowledge operating below the level of explicit decision-making. Not intuition in the mystical sense. Pattern recognition built from enough specific experiences of specific divergences that the reading happens before the deliberation.
And alongside the terrain knowledge, something else develops. The coaxing and musings that build field density become more efficient, not because the questions improve but because the practitioner has accumulated enough context that small additions produce large developments. The confirmation discipline becomes faster, not because the checking becomes less rigorous but because the practitioner's feel for the difference between solid and approximately right has been calibrated by enough specific experiences. The reseeding becomes more precise, not because the process changes but because the practitioner has learned what the dense core of a field actually looks like and can identify it quickly.
At a certain point in this development, something changes that is harder to describe than the individual practices. The routing, the divergence reading, the confirmation, the reseeding, they have been running long enough to begin operating in relation to each other rather than being managed individually. The practitioner who was directing each instrument finds that the instruments have started directing each other. That is what Part 3 is about.
Part 3 reaches the meta skill. Not the individual practices but the capacity that operates above them, and what it means for the practitioner's role when it arrives. There is a moment in the development of any practice when you stop managing the components individually and start noticing that they are managing each other.
The routing decision informs what divergence to expect. The divergence reading informs whether the confirmation is complete. The confirmation discipline reveals what needs to be carried into the reseed. The reseeded thread generates the next routing decision. Not a sequence, a loop. Each practice continuously checking and being checked by the others.
When that loop has been running long enough, something changes that is harder to describe than any of the individual practices. The practitioner who was directing the instruments finds that the instruments have started directing each other. The role changes. Not less skilled, differently placed. The skill is no longer in executing each move. It is in maintaining the conditions under which the moves can happen.
The data is in the difference.
The instruments begin to direct each other. What the meta skill is, where it comes from, and what the practitioner's role becomes when it arrives. Part 3 of 3.
The meta skill does not appear on its own. It emerges from the accumulation of specific experiences of specific practices. The routing decision made and tested, the divergence read and followed, the confirmation that revealed drift. The reseed that produced something sharper than the extended session it replaced. Each specific experience adds something to the practitioner's feel for how the practices relate to each other, not as theory, but as accumulated contact with what actually happens when they are run.
The scanner system is the clearest demonstration of this accumulation. It began as a musing about model disagreement. The testing of that musing produced the first routing insight that different systems attended to genuinely different dimensions of the same material. The routing insight produced the first divergence reading discipline, that the gap between systems was a map rather than a problem. The divergence reading discipline produced the confirmation habit that the output from a scanner pass needed to be tested against what it was built to find before being accepted. Each practice emerged from the one before it. None of them was designed in advance.
The clearest sign that the meta skill has arrived is what happens to prompting. The practitioner stops being the person who writes the prompts. They become the person who maintains the conditions under which the right prompts write themselves. The system crystallizes the next step from the accumulated field, the deep research report to be handed to another system, the scanner pass calibrated to the specific domain, the think package assembled for reseeding, and the practitioner's role is recognition, confirming that what crystallized is solid before the next stage depends on it.
This is not delegation. The prompt that crystallizes from an accumulated field is more precise than any prompt the practitioner could have written cold, not because the system is smarter, but because the field contains information the practitioner could not hold in mind without the session that developed it. The vocabulary that has been built. The constraints that have been established. The specific shape of what is being constructed. The system encodes all of it into the prompt. The practitioner confirms that the encoding is accurate. The precision comes from the accumulation, not from the delegation.
The musing and coaxing practices are not preliminary steps that happen before the real work begins. They are the practices that maintain the conditions the meta skill requires. Without them, the field goes thin. Dense material sent through a routing table produces genuine divergence. Thin material produces consensus around the generic. The musings are what keep the material dense. The coaxing is what keeps the field developing in directions that have not yet been specified.
A musing held loosely, what if model disagreement was signal rather than noise, is the field maintenance practice at its most essential. It does not specify a direction. It opens one. The coaxing that follows, the loose associative questions, the small additions that let the understanding develop without demanding a shape from it, is the practice of keeping that direction alive while the field builds the density that will eventually crystallize into something testable. The musing and coaxing do not look like work from outside. They are the work that makes all the other work possible.
The confirmation discipline changes when the meta skill is operating. It stops being a step that happens after the prompt has been constructed and starts being a continuous presence throughout the session. The practitioner is not waiting for a completed output to check. They are reading the developing output in real time, noticing drift as it forms, recognizing when the crystallization is going toward approximately right rather than solid, adjusting the field before the output has settled into the wrong form.
The systems refactor in small ways. A phrase shifts slightly. A constraint that was explicit becomes implicit. A vocabulary term gets replaced by a near synonym that carries a different weight. Each shift is small. Accumulated over a long session or across multiple reseeds, they produce an output that is no longer exactly what the field accumulated, it is the field's content processed through the system's own tendencies. The practitioner who is not running the continuous check does not notice until the output fails the car test. The practitioner who is running it catches the drift while it is still a tendency rather than a conclusion.
Reseeding is not a recovery operation. In the meta skill, it is a regular practice, the rhythm of the work rather than a response to something going wrong. Every one extended session accumulates alongside its density. The vocabulary built through careful exchanges sits in the same context as the tangents explored and set aside, the dead ends identified, the framings that were useful at an earlier phase. The reseed is the discipline of separating what is worth carrying from what should be left behind, before the accumulation produces drift rather than after.
The think package built for reseeding is not a summary of what happened. It is a crystallization of what matters to carry forward, built with the same confirmation discipline applied to the session's output. Does the vocabulary that made it in still carry the weight it developed? Are the constraints that were established present in the package, or have they softened into suggestions? Does the shape of what is being built arrive in the new thread with enough density to produce genuine divergence when it is tested? Or has the distillation produced something too thin to give the next generation somewhere real to go?
When the meta skill is operating, the practitioner's role is maintaining the conditions rather than executing the steps. Musing and coaxing to keep the field alive and developing. Reading divergence to keep the field calibrated. Confirming and reconfirming to keep the output solid. Reseeding to keep the compounding from stalling. None of these is a step in a process. They are the conditions under which the process runs. The practitioner who has developed the meta skill is not doing more than the practitioner who is learning the individual practices. They are doing something differently placed.
From the outside, this looks like the practitioner doing less. The prompts arrive rather than being laboriously constructed. The routing happens without apparent deliberation. The reseeds are produced quickly and cleanly. The confirmations happen throughout rather than as a distinct final step. What looks like less effort is accumulated terrain knowledge operating below the level of deliberate thought. Not less skill but more thoroughly internalized skill. No longer requiring the deliberation that was once necessary because the pattern recognition has developed to the point where it happens before the deliberation.
The meta skill also includes knowing when the conditions have degraded. When the field has gone thin. When the residue has become crust. Yesterday's discovery deciding today's answer rather than informing it. When a system has updated and the terrain has shifted beneath the routing map drawn by months of friction. When the confirmations keep returning approximately right rather than solid, and the source is not drift in the output but thinness in what the field has become.
The response is not to push harder. Generating faster from a thin field produces more of what isn't working, polished and confident and going nowhere. The response is field enrichment before artifact pressure. Musing without demanding. Research without specification. Coaxing without a target shape. Sometimes a day spent in loose associative conversation with no output pressure is exactly what the next artifact needed. The wandering was the enrichment. It did not look like practice. It was the practice that made everything after it possible.
The loop is still running underneath all of it. Routing tells you what divergence to expect. Divergence tells you what to confirm. Confirmation tells you what to carry into the reseed. The reseed changes the next routing decision. That loop does not stop when the meta skill arrives. It becomes the substrate the meta skill runs on. There is a field that develops alongside the meta skill that has no better name than substrate sense. The practitioner registers when a system's yield has changed quality before the rational mind has confirmed it. The output looks similar to what it was producing before. The surface signals are the same. Something in the texture is different, less dense, more generic at the edges, the divergence between systems narrower than it should be for material this specific. The substrate sense is the body of accumulated terrain knowledge detecting a change before the analysis has named it.
When a model updates and the terrain shifts, the routing table drawn by months of friction may no longer describe the landscape it was built on. The substrate sense detects this before the rational mind accepts it. The yield feels different, the confirmations feel different, the divergences feel like they are coming from a different place than they were. The practitioner who has only the routing table is more vulnerable than the practitioner who also has the feel. The table describes a terrain that existed. The feel detects when the terrain has moved underneath the description. Both are necessary. The feel is what makes the table useful rather than misleading when the ground has changed.
The series that this video concludes has moved from a single question, what is the disagreement between systems actually made of, through the practice of reading the gaps, and arrived here, at the meta skill that emerges when the individual practices have been running long enough to start operating in relation to each other. That arc is not a curriculum. It is the shape of how this kind of knowledge actually develops, from a musing to a discovery, to a practice to a capacity that operates above the practices that compose it.
The scanner system that began as a musing is one instance of this arcade. The routing table that developed from repeated friction is another. The confirmation discipline that formed from enough experiences of drift is a third. Each one began small, developed through accumulated contact with what actually happened, and became part of a larger practice that none of them could produce alone. The whole is not the sum of the parts. It is what the parts became when they had been operating in relation to each other long enough to develop coherence.
The most powerful instruments in this practice were not designed. They were discovered by someone who noticed the disagreement and asked what it was made of instead of which side was right. That question is still available. The disagreements are still there in every multi-system session. The data is still in the difference. What changes with the meta-skill is not the question. It is the practitioner who is asking it, and what they can do with what the answer reveals. The disagreement between systems is the honest reading of your material. The practice is learning to read it. The meta-skill is what that learning becomes when it has run long enough.